Right now, as you watch this video, there's a 90% chance the medicine in your cabinet was made in a country you've never thought about. Not the United States, not Europe, not even close. A single region controls the production of nearly 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, the chemical compounds that make drugs actually work. When COVID-19 hit, the United States discovered it couldn't manufacture basic antibiotics or common pain relievers without imports. Hospitals faced shortages of sedatives for ventilators. Even ibuprofen became scarce. And the terrifying part? This wasn't a supply chain failure. It was the supply chain working exactly as designed. So how did the world's most critical industry end up concentrated in the hands of a few manufacturers, in a handful of regions, beyond the control of most Western governments? This is the story of the invisible empire that decides who gets medicine and who doesn't. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history are woven together to shape the world we live in. Today, we're exposing one of the most dangerous dependencies in modern civilization. One that operates quietly beneath global commerce, determining the fate of billions. Let's begin. For most of human history, medicine was local. Apothecaries extracted compounds from plants. Pharmacists mixed treatments in laboratories. Drugs were manufactured close to where they were consumed, because chemistry was simple and transportation was slow. But the 20th century changed everything. The discovery of penicillin in 1928, followed by synthetic pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and chemotherapy drugs, required industrial-scale production. Manufacturing these compounds demanded specialized facilities, strict quality control, and massive capital investment. Naturally, production centralized in the world's wealthiest nations. By the 1980s, the United States and Western Europe dominated pharmaceutical manufacturing. American companies like Pfizer, Merck, and Bristol-Myers Squibb didn't just hold the patents. They owned the factories, employed the chemists, and controlled every step from molecule to market. It was complete vertical integration, safe, regulated, domestic. But then the economics shifted. A quiet transformation in global trade policy began dismantling this model, not through force or regulation, but through the relentless pursuit of lower costs. And within just 2 decades, the entire supply chain had migrated east. The question is, how did this happen without anyone noticing? The answer begins in the 1990s, with an economic philosophy that would reshape global manufacturing. In 1995, the World Trade Organization formalized a new era of globalization. Trade barriers fell. Capital flowed freely across borders, and corporations discovered they could cut costs dramatically by moving production overseas. Pharmaceutical companies faced pressure from multiple directions. Generic drugs, medications whose patents had expired, generated thin profit margins. Manufacturing them in high-wage countries with strict environmental regulations was expensive. Meanwhile, Wall Street demanded quarterly earnings growth. The solution was obvious: outsource. China and India presented an irresistible proposition. Labor costs were 70 to 80% lower than in the West. Environmental enforcement was minimal, and both governments were aggressively courting foreign pharmaceutical investment with tax breaks and streamlined approvals. The migration began slowly in the late 1990s. First, it was just basic generic antibiotics, then common pain relievers, then blood pressure medications. By the early 2000s, it became a strategic transformation. China focused on active pharmaceutical ingredients, the complex chemical compounds that give medicines their therapeutic effect. These are the raw materials of the drug industry, requiring sophisticated chemistry, but benefiting enormously from economies of scale. India pursued a different strategy, building on its legacy of skilled chemists and strong intellectual property laws that favored generic production. Indian companies specialized in finished dosage forms, taking those Chinese ingredients and formulating them into pills, capsules, and injectables. Together, they formed a seamless supply chain. And here's the critical detail most people miss. Western regulatory agencies encouraged this transition. The FDA began approving overseas manufacturing facilities at an accelerating pace. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of FDA-registered pharmaceutical plants in China increased by over 400%. In India, the number doubled. Politicians in both parties celebrated the arrangement. Pharmaceutical costs were dropping. Generic drugs became more accessible. Consumer prices fell. But no one in power asked the essential question: what happens when we no longer control the production of drugs our citizens need to survive? By 2010, China manufactured approximately 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. The United States, which had pioneered antibiotic production during World War II, couldn't produce a single gram of penicillin domestically. The strategic shift was complete, and it had happened almost invisibly. China didn't stumble into pharmaceutical dominance through market forces alone. It was industrial policy, deliberate and decades in the making. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. But unlike most developing nations, China had a plan. The Chinese government identified pharmaceuticals as a strategic pillar industry, one that could generate export revenue, employ millions, provide leverage in international relations, and reduce dependency on Western imports. So Beijing invested heavily. Between 2000 and 2015, the Chinese government funneled an estimated $24 billion into pharmaceutical infrastructure. Massive chemical plants rose in Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces, regions that became the epicenter of global drug production. Local governments offered tax holidays, free land, and regulatory fast-tracking. Banks provided low-interest loans. Environmental inspections were flexible. Western pharmaceutical companies didn't resist this shift. They embraced it. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck and GlaxoSmithKline all established manufacturing operations in China, not just to access the Chinese market, but to produce for the entire world at a fraction of Western costs. The cost savings were staggering. In China, the same compound cost $200, $300. Meanwhile, India followed a parallel path with one crucial difference. While China controlled raw ingredients, India became the pharmacy of the developing world. Companies like Sun Pharmaceutical, Dr. Reddy's, Cipla, and Lupin built massive generic drug empires. By 2015, India supplied 50% of global generic drug demand and 40% of generic prescriptions in the United States. The global pharmaceutical supply chain had become a perfect division of labor. China produced the ingredients. India formulated them into finished drugs. Western companies added their branding and distribution networks. It was efficient, profitable, and almost completely invisible to consumers. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. Because when you concentrate production in just two countries, you don't just create efficiency, you create vulnerability. And soon, the world would pay the price. December 2019. A novel coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, Hubei province, China. Within 8 weeks, COVID-19 had spread to every continent. By March 2020, global lockdowns had begun. And then the cracks appeared. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, hospital pharmacies began running short of critical medications. First, it was sedatives: propofol, midazolam, and fentanyl. The drugs used to keep ventilated COVID patients comfortable. Then antibiotics used to treat secondary infections. Then common medications like albuterol inhalers for asthma patients. The United States, with the world's most expensive healthcare system, faced shortages of basic generic drugs. Why? Because Chinese factories had shut down. In late January 2020, the Chinese government extended the Lunar New Year holiday indefinitely, closing factories nationwide to contain the virus. Pharmaceutical plants in Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces went dark. Shipments stopped. Container ships sat empty in ports. Then came the export restrictions. In March 2020, China's Ministry of Commerce announced tighter controls on pharmaceutical exports, officially to ensure domestic supply during the emergency. Key ingredients for antibiotics, antivirals, and even vitamin C were restricted. The message was subtle but clear. When crisis comes, we take care of our own first. India, which depends on China for approximately 70% of its active pharmaceutical ingredient imports, panicked. On March 3, 2020, India banned the export of 26 essential medications, including paracetamol, acetaminophen, several antibiotics, and hormones. Hydroxychloroquine, controversially touted as a COVID treatment, was added to the list days later. Suddenly, the global pharmaceutical supply chain seized up. The United States couldn't source ingredients. European nations scrambled for alternatives. Developing countries, which relied almost entirely on Indian generics, were cut off. Hospitals began rationing medications. Doctors made impossible choices about which patients received treatments. And Western governments discovered something terrifying. They had no plan B. The United States had exactly one remaining facility capable of producing penicillin's key ingredient. It was operating at capacity and couldn't scale up. For critical medications like heparin, a blood thinner essential for surgery and dialysis, the US was 100% dependent on Chinese imports. The pandemic didn't break the pharmaceutical supply chain. It revealed that the supply chain had always been broken, held together by the fragile assumption that global trade would never be disrupted. When that assumption failed, millions of lives hung in the balance. The response was swift, at least rhetorically. In May 2020, President Trump signed an executive order aimed at reducing dependence on foreign pharmaceutical supply chains. The FDA announced plans for stricter oversight of overseas facilities. The European Union launched an investigation into pharmaceutical supply chain vulnerabilities. Japan pledged $2.2 billion to help Japanese companies move production out of China. Politicians across the political spectrum agreed critical pharmaceutical manufacturing needed to return home. But 5 years later, the structure has barely changed. Why? Because the economics remain unchanged. Manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients in the United States costs 3 to 5 times more than in China. Building a single modern pharmaceutical plant requires $500 million to $1 billion in capital investment and takes 5 to 7 years from planning to operation. Environmental regulations in the US are strict and expensive to comply with. Labor costs are higher. And generic drug prices, which consumers and insurance companies have grown accustomed to, don't generate sufficient profit margins to justify domestic production. Some progress has been made. The US government established the Strategic National Stockpile for critical medications. A few companies received subsidies to reshore production of specific antibiotics. But these are band-aids on a structural problem. As of 2024, China still produces an estimated 75 to 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. India still supplies approximately 40% of US generic prescriptions. And just a handful of Chinese provinces, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Shandong, and Hebei, contain the factories that produce the majority of the world's antibiotics, blood pressure medications, and common pain relievers. The concentration has actually increased. Between 2020 and 2023, several smaller pharmaceutical manufacturers in China and India consolidated. The top 20 Chinese pharmaceutical ingredient producers now control over 60% of global production. The pandemic didn't trigger a revolution in pharmaceutical supply chains. It triggered a realization, one that governments acknowledged, then quietly shelved because the cost of fixing it was deemed too high. The empire didn't collapse. It just became impossible to ignore. Today, the pharmaceutical supply chain is more concentrated and more geopolitically volatile than at any point in history. Let's examine the numbers. Over 90% of antibiotics consumed in the United States are manufactured using active ingredients from China. India produces approximately 60% of global vaccine supply, and an estimated 80–85% of generic drugs sold in American pharmacies depend on ingredients or finished formulations from just 2 countries. This isn't merely an economic issue, it's a national security vulnerability. China has demonstrated willingness to use pharmaceutical leverage for political purposes, subtly but deliberately. In March 2020, Chinese state media outlet Xinhua published an article suggesting Beijing could impose pharmaceutical export controls as retaliation for US criticism of China's COVID response. The article ominously asked, what if China announces an export ban on medicines to the US? The threat was never executed, but the message resonated in Washington. In 2022, amid tensions over Taiwan and semiconductor trade restrictions, Chinese officials quietly delayed export approvals for certain pharmaceutical ingredients. The delays were never officially explained, but the timing was clear. India has similarly demonstrated that drug supply can be weaponized. Beyond the 2020 export bans, India restricted COVID vaccine exports in 2021 to prioritize domestic inoculation, leaving COVAX, the international program supplying vaccines to developing nations, desperately short of doses. When geopolitics and pharmaceutical dependence intersect, leverage becomes a weapon. And the West has virtually no counter-leverage. Rebuilding domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing isn't just expensive, it's slow. Even with unlimited funding, constructing the chemical plants, training specialized workers, and achieving regulatory compliance would take 7 to 10 years minimum. Some efforts are underway. The US CHIPS Act included provisions for pharmaceutical manufacturing. The EU has launched a pharmaceutical strategy for Europe. Several biotech startups are exploring advanced manufacturing techniques. But these initiatives will take years to bear fruit, if they succeed at all. Meanwhile, the concentration continues. Smaller manufacturers can't compete with Chinese scale and Indian efficiency. Consolidation intensifies, and the fundamental dependency deepens. The system persists not because it's safe, secure, or strategically sound. It persists because it's profitable, and because changing it requires a level of political will and capital investment that no government has been willing to commit, until the next crisis forces their hand. So what have we learned from this hidden empire of pharmaceutical power? First, supply chain efficiency and supply chain security are fundamentally different goals, often in direct opposition. The cheapest system is rarely the most resilient system. Second, economic sovereignty and national sovereignty are inseparable. A nation that cannot produce the medicines its citizens need to survive has surrendered a critical dimension of independence, regardless of its military strength or economic size. And third, industrial policy matters. China and India didn't dominate pharmaceutical manufacturing by accident. They identified a strategic industry, invested systematically, and executed a multi-decade plan. The West, meanwhile, let market forces dictate strategy, and discovered that markets optimize for profit, not security. The real power behind the world's pharmaceutical supply isn't a sinister conspiracy or a shadowy cabal. It's a system, one built on decades of rational economic decisions, corporate cost-cutting, and political short-termism. Each individual decision made sense in isolation. Outsourcing production cut costs. Consumers got cheaper drugs, companies increased profit margins. Politicians could claim they'd made healthcare more affordable, but collectively those decisions created a strategic vulnerability that now threatens hundreds of millions of lives. The next pandemic, the next geopolitical crisis, or the next trade war will expose the same fundamental weakness. We've outsourced survival itself, and until the economic incentives change, until governments treat pharmaceutical production as critical infrastructure rather than just another commodity, the dependency will only deepen. Because in the world of wealth and power, history never ends, it just changes hands. The question is, who will hold that power next, and what will they demand in return? If you found this investigation valuable, like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and hit the bell icon. Because the next story might reveal another hidden system shaping your life without your knowledge. The truth is out there. We just have to be willing to look. Until next time, stay curious.